Right, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for coming into the Royal Society today. My name's Rupert Baker. I'm the library manager here. I recognise a lot of faces in the audience, so thanks to everyone for coming in. And this is the fifth in our series of Spring 2007 talks, with the aim of just getting people into the library to have a look at some of the resources from our rich book and archival collections, and to encourage people to come in and register to use the library on a regular basis. If any of you haven't registered as readers, we have registration forms at the back of the room, and you're all very welcome to come back and use us. 10 o'clock to 5 o'clock, Monday to Friday, we are open. If anyone here is a first-time visitor to the Royal Society, I'll give you a one-paragraph summary of our history. The Royal Society of London for Improving Natural Knowledge was founded in 1660, and we received our Royal Charter, our first Royal Charter, in 1662. We're the world's oldest scientific society in continuous existence, and also function as the UK's National Science Academy. Our fellowship currently numbers around 1,400 of the world's leading scientists. Now, today's event is designed to highlight our exhibition on the Royal Society in India, which is down in our basement archive display area until the end of June. And also to give people the opportunity to see some of these large format, beautiful colour books, some of which were too big to go in the display cases, so I thought it would be an opportunity to have a look through those. The format of today's event, the first part of the talk will be given by Anna Winterbottom. She's going to talk about early Royal Society connections with India, highlighting the role of the East India Company. Then you'll hear a little bit from me on 4 fellows of the Royal Society with East India Company connections who produced these books of spectacular illustrations of the natural history of India, Indian flora and fauna. So I'd like to formally introduce Anna Winterbottom. Anna's working here on our famous Hook folio, the transcription of the Hook folio. She has a background in Indian Ocean history, and she's currently writing a PhD on the relationship between the East India Company and the Royal Society, with reference to the wider ideological status of science and imperialism, on which I'm sure she will expand in the next 15 minutes or so.
Thank you very much, Rupert, for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming along today. As Rupert said, I'm going to talk about the relationship between the East India Company and the Royal Society. Cooperation between these two entities contributed to advance scientific knowledge, to promote the reputation of the Society and the power of the East India Company, and later of the Imperial Government, over their empire in India, as well as to facilitate exchanges of ideas between India and Britain. The East India Company was established by Royal Charter in 1660, 60 years before the Royal Society, and was granted a monopoly over the Eastern trade, initially for 15 years. The company was formed from merchant seamen and governed from London by a court of committee. The direct trade with India overtook the spice trade as its most important activity from the 1640s, and it established trading bases or factories in Madras, now Chennai, Bombay, now Mumbai, and Calcutta, now Kolkata. The role of the company changed gradually with the territories gained in Bengal after military advances in the mid-18th century. By the end of the 18th century, the company was losing its trading privileges, and thereafter played a mainly military and administrative role until its demise in the mid-19th century. The first thing to remember when thinking about contacts between the East India Company and the Royal Society is that their members were drawn from a similar class of Londoners and often overlapped. I put some of the names here of prominent fellows who were also involved in the East India Company. For example, the names of Jeremy Sandbrook and John Lawrence are prominent in the early council meetings of the Royal Society and in the correspondence of the East India Company, of which both these men were commissioners. John Evelyn was also closely connected with both organisations, including a personal connection with Sir Josiah Child, the director of the East India Company. All 3 of these men held in their names the Royal Society's stocks in the East India Company, bought with the funds from the sale of Trinity College in 1682. Overlapping membership and shared practical and financial concerns provided a basis for cooperation over a range of subjects between the two entities. Often this includes subjects that we would not necessarily now consider to be scientific, such as the study of linguistics, which was facilitated by the valuable Oriental Library, built up by the Royal Society by the end of the 19th century, before its eventual transfer to the India Office. The East India Company was often used by the Royal Society to learn not only about India's potential as a site of collecting drugs, making astronomical observations, and so on, but also as a channel for the acquisition of Indian knowledge about these subjects. Because East India Company agents often learned local languages, they were well placed to acquire local knowledge, for example about the medicinal uses of plants, which was then transmitted to the Royal Society to be compared with communications received from elsewhere, and the records left by other travellers. Of course, this knowledge was not always gained through consensual exchange, but sometimes involved dubious practices such as the removal of ancient texts and the forced acquisition of specimens. I'll talk first about navigation and astronomy. One of the most important issues for the East India Company was, of course, to ensure that their ships reached their destinations. In the 17th century, the calculation of longitude was still a major problem. Longitude is calculated by the difference between the observer's local time and the time at a fixed reference point, like Greenwich or Paris. It's found by comparing the time at which the star or the sun passes across the reference meridian. Calculating longitude therefore involves making exact timekeepers. This was a constant challenge for the Royal Society, to design a timepiece that would keep the correct time wherever it was, including aboard a ship. This involved experiments with different types of pendulums and efforts to develop balance springs for timekeepers. These efforts by the Royal Society were facilitated by the East India Company, whose agents were involved in the testing of the pendulums and watches in different temperatures and altitudes. Calculating longitude also involves making precise astronomical observations at the meridians. The need for practical astronomy that could be applied to the navigation of the treacherous waters of the Coromandel coast was also pressing. In 1786, therefore, William Petrie, a senior merchant in the East India Company, built an observatory in Madras, which was pressed into official service the next year, as part of the survey of the coast being carried out by Michael Topping. Petrie was elected to the Royal Society in 1795. The observatory at Madras continued to play an important part in imperial astronomy. Its role in surveying was enhanced after the fall of Tipu Sultan in 1799, when the empire acquired swathes of new land. After 1830, the observatory also made significant contributions to astronomy, including producing a catalogue of the southern stars and observations of transits and solar eclipses. These findings were published in both English and in several Indian languages. Perhaps the first intimation of Indian astronomical knowledge that reached the Royal Society was with the publication of a letter in 1772 from John Gould to the Astronomer Royal, in which he sketched and described a depiction of the signs of the zodiac on a pagoda near Cape Comorin in India. These are out on the table just here. Also on display is Robert Barker's account of the observatory at Benares, which was published in 1777 in Philosophical Transactions. In this report, Barker indicates that Brahmin priests in Benares were aware of approaching eclipses of the sun and moon, but he was unable to determine from conversation how they gained this knowledge. He was informed of tables written in Sanskrit, which few now understood. He was then led to the observatory, said to have been built by the Emperor Akbar, where he was surprised to discover instruments that, although they were apparently 200 years old, the gradations and divisions on the several arcs appeared as well cut and accurately divided as if they'd been the performance of a modern artist. Barker adopted a view that became widely held among Orientalist scholars, rightly or wrongly, that the sciences and arts had declined in India, and that it was therefore necessary to investigate the older Sanskrit writings on the subject. In 1792, Samuel Davis was elected FRS on the basis of his research in this area, published in Asiatic Researches. He was followed by Henry Harvey, elected for the same reason in 1825. The desire of the Royal Society to discover more about Indian astronomy thus gave impetus to Western scholars to learn Oriental languages, a process that was institutionalized with the establishment of the Sanskrit College in Benares in the early 1790s. And moving on to the subject of mapping, this slide shows John Gilby's map of Asia, published in 1673. In the early days of the East India Company, maps were still largely unreliable, and throughout the 17th century, travellers often had to depend on accounts of previous voyages, such as Linscotton's Discourse of Voyages into the East and West Indies, which was published in 1598. The Royal Society were involved with several early attempts to produce more accurate maps and guides. Robert Hooke, Christopher Wren and John Evelyn, among others, were involved with the English Atlas project, taken on first by John Ogilvy and later by Moses Pitt. This project, which aimed to collate and amend previous maps on the basis of comparisons and corrections made by travellers, was never completed, but as you can see, the map for Asia was realised, and it bears the arms of the East India Company. Other efforts to promote the systematic recording of information about journeys and places include the General Heads for a Natural History of a Country, Great or Small, imparted by Robert Boyle, which was printed in the very first edition of Philosophical Transactions in 1666, and the Directions to Seamen, printed in the Society's Journal the following year. Boyle's piece stresses the need to make exact maps showing geographical features and potential navigational hazards, alongside the need for magnetic observations to understand to advance the scientific understanding of the phenomenon. The mid-18th century expansion in the territorial extent of the empire created a new role in the early colonial administration for the East India Company. The first Surveyor General, appointed in 1767 by the East India Company, was James Winnell. Winnell was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1781, around which time he also published 2 accounts of his mapping experiences in Bengal and the Empire of the Great Mogul. One of them is now on the table here. These accounts make it clear that Winnell compiled his maps using a wide range of informants, including Indian and British soldiers and missionaries, as well as the tables compiled of districts under the Emperor Akbar, who ruled India in the last half of the 16th century, and had used them to levy taxes. Winnell's 1788 map of Hindustan, or the Mughal Empire, from the latest authorities, is dedicated to the President of the Royal Society. As Joseph Banks hoped when presenting Winnell with the Copley Medal for his achievement, this map of India went on to inspire other large-scale projects of this nature, including the mapping of England. The initial success of mapping in India led to other large-scale exercises in surveying, combined with scientific observation. The Great Trigonometrical Survey was the most high-profile and successful of these efforts. Conceived in 1799 by William Lamberton using a method of triangulation, perhaps based on that communicated to the Royal Society by William Topping a decade earlier, to measure a meridian from the north to the south of India, the largest area that had ever been attempted. The use of triangulation along a meridian, such as the Great Arc formed by the survey, is also a means of calculating the radius of the Earth, a goal since the work of Newton. Unsurprisingly then, the Royal Society was intimately connected with this enterprise, electing 15 of the surveyors involved, most famously George Everest, superintendent of the survey from 1823, and after 1830, Surveyor General of India. Everest took the work of the survey to completion at the end of the Arc of the Himalayas in 1843, as well as making improvements to surveying instruments, such as theodolites, perambulators, and barometers. The stations set up in India also provided the Royal Society and the wealth of other scientific organisations that had emerged by this point, with a venue for further experiments. During the Trigonometrical Survey, Edward Sabine directed a number of pendulum experiments at the station. The Great Magnetic Survey aimed to establish a network of stations around the world to record variations in the strength and direction of the Earth's magnetism. Large-scale projects with official backing such as these, and the infrastructure they established, led to an early Institutionalisation of Science in India. By the end of the 19th century, there were 10 scientific bodies in India. These bodies were part of the drive for self-sufficiency in the colonies, but also provided inspiration for many innovations in government regulation of science in England. The Royal Society continued to play an advisory role with respect to science in India, having by the 1880s become the main consultant used by the British government for scientific policy. The relationship of consultancy and exchange in policy continued into the independence period, with the relationship of Patrick Blackett and Prime Minister Nehru. And moving on to collections of plant specimens, which I know is something that Rupert will tell you more about. Encounters with new species of plants and animals was important from both scientific and practical points of view. This became another area in which collaboration between the Royal Society and the East India Company allowed them to learn from Indian knowledge and systems of classification. Of course, the process of Western explorers learning from their encounters with new plants and their local uses was not new. For example, Garcia de Orta had produced important work on Indian plants and their uses, including noting a remedy for cholera in the early 16th century. Botanical gardens containing exotic species began in Europe in the mid-15th century, extending the concept of Indian and Arabic spice gardens from which they were derived, to bring together species from all over the world. The collaboration between the East India Company and the Royal Society to collect plants and knowledge of their medicinal properties were thus part of a long process of developing unified classifications for species. The Royal Society often had contact with the East India Company's surgeons, who were regularly faced with unknown diseases and needed to understand the medicinal properties of unfamiliar plants. In some cases, surgeons sent specimens or descriptions of plants to the Royal Society to confirm the medicinal properties which they had learnt from observations of their local use. One example of such a collaboration is provided by the relationship between Sam Brown and James Pettiver. Brown was a botanist employed by the East India Company who sent back detailed descriptions of the plants he found. These lists are an interesting mixture of Latin, Sanskrit and Arabic names, coupled with oral accounts of their use. The replies sent by Pettiver to some of Brown's letters are also published in the Philosophical Transactions, and add to Brown's descriptions through a process of comparison with other accounts like Orta's work, Ray's History of Plants, and Sloane's Catalogue of Jamaican Plants. Pettiver also refers to Richard Sambach, another East India Company surgeon with whom he had a similar relationship, and James Cunningham, who sent him specimens from China. Similarly, John Fryer, an East India Company surgeon at Bombay, produced his new account of East India and Persia in 1681 under the auspices of the Royal Society. This included a wide range of observations from local practice and personal experience, including noting, long before Cook, that scurvy could be cured by eating citrus fruit. Members of the Royal Society collected accounts of the uses of plants and codified these into systems of classification by a process of comparison with similar accounts received from other parts of the world. This was of great use to the East India Company surgeons, who were often unable to access such literature themselves, as well as providing the Royal Society with agents to collect plants and accounts of their use. This relationship was established by the end of the 17th century and continued beyond the establishment of the empire in Bengal. Perhaps the most prolific collector of plants was Joseph Banks, president of the Royal Society from 1798 to 1820, and a contemporary and correspondent of the botanist Linnaeus, Daniel Solander of the British Museum, and of William Jones, who was the founder of the Asiatic Society of Bengal. He corresponded extensively with the medical officers and directors of the East India Company. For example, a letter from Banks to the company advising on the introduction of tea growing in parts of India is held in the British Library. With his assumption of the role of advisor, Banks solidified the mutual creation of positions of authority for the Royal Society and the East India Company in their collaboration to improve the world through the collection, categorization, and application of natural knowledge. During the 19th century, the administration of India passed gradually from the hands of the East India Company into those of colonial administrators. However, the interest of the Royal Society in collecting and classifying Indian plants continued, and the advisory role that their members once played with respect to the East India Company formed the basis of their advice to the colonial government. Joseph Dalton Hooker received official support for his trip to the Central and Eastern Himalayas in 1847-9. Some of the illustrations from Hooker's collection of around 7,000 specimens are shown downstairs. Connections with the botanical gardens of Calcutta, Bangalore, Madras and Bombay also remained important, including through Wallich, the superintendent of the Calcutta Garden, whose drawings of plant specimens are also on display. So, in conclusion, the relationship between the East India Company and the Royal Society demonstrates that the beginnings of science under imperialism in India did not stem simply from innovations exported from Britain. Instead, it developed as a result of encounters with new species of plants, geographical and agricultural issues, and with modern and ancient Indian knowledge. The relationships between members of the Royal Society and the East India Company began a long tradition of scientific exchange between Britain and India.
Right, just 10 more minutes from me. I'd just like to give you a little bit more detail on some of these books that we're going to show you in a few minutes, written by 4 fellows of the Royal Society, usually with East India Company connections. And they're all beautiful illustrations of the flora and fauna of India. First one is where the snake charmer part of the title of this talk comes in. It's by Patrick Russell, FRS, his account of Indian serpents. Now, Russell first came to prominence as the physician at the English Levant Company in Aleppo. The local pasha granted him the unusual privilege of mark of respect of allowing him to wear a turban, which is how he's depicted in the frontispiece of his book. So that's Patrick Russell. In 1785, Russell became botanist and naturalist to the East India Company in the government of Madras, and he collected a large number of specimens of plants and fish, and in particular the poisonous snakes of the Coromandel coast. His account of these serpents was published in 1796 to 1801, 2 bound-up volumes in one. It was the first such publication on Indian snakes, and it relied extensively on local knowledge, local people telling him which snakes were poisonous and which were harmless. So it was a very practical guide as well as a beautiful work of art. For example, if you'd read that book at the time, or if you had it tucked under your arm walking through the Coromandel countryside, you would know that this snake on the left, which the locals call the Urdia snake, has no fangs, so you're perfectly safe with that one. This one you probably recognise as a hooded cobra, which Russell described as generally reputed the most dangerous of the serpent tribe in the East Indies. And he goes on to give a description of how the snake charmers use this in their act. You'll be able to read that when you get the chance to look at that book in a few minutes. And the one at the bottom, also rather nasty, Russell states that from its venomous appearance, no doubt can be entertained of its atrociousness. So again, steer well clear of that when walking through Coromandel. The one on the right, which was known as the Pasariki Pam, is found in trees and, according to Russell, said to attack passengers, aiming particularly at the eyes. But they did some scientific tests at the time and found out that its bite on chickens produced no other effect than pain. So it couldn't do much damage to a chicken, so you were probably all right if that bit you in the wild. Next, a gentleman who Anna has already mentioned, Nathaniel Wally, is it? Right, okay. Also a fellow of the Royal Society, also connected with the East India Company. His first introduction to the East India Company wasn't a very auspicious one. He was imprisoned by them. Reason for this being he was a Danish medical man and botanist. He was surgeon to the Danish colony at Serampore in 1807. But the Danes were in alliance with Napoleon at the time. So the East India Company came along the following year and seized the colony at Serampore and threw Wallach into jail. But fairly briefly, because they immediately recognised that he was a gentleman and a scholar, and they let him out on parole after a year. And he went on to take a post at the Royal Botanic Garden in Calcutta, travelling extensively also in Nepal and Burma. And he instigated a program in Calcutta of collecting and describing new plants and distributing specimens, as Anna has already mentioned, around British and European and North American gardens. He was particularly famed for his innovative packing methods. He was probably the best of these gentlemen at getting the specimens across the seas and getting them out unharmed at the other end. He was invalided back to England in 1828, and he took 8,000 plant specimens with him. And this was when he wrote his classic 3-volume work, Plantae Asiaticae Rariores, of which we have 1 volume out on display here. I have the names of these plants if anyone is a real plant buff. I'll tell you later though. Not that I know of. That one's a Hibiscus lindley. I don't know, maybe you can tell me if Pongamia or Dilenia have medicinal properties. No, I'm not a great plant expert. Okay, we've done the snake charmer. This gentleman is the bird stuffer, maybe a name that you've all heard of, John Gould. He's particularly famous for his later multi-volume works such as The Birds of Australia and The Birds of Asia. This was his first published work, A Century of Birds from the Himalaya Mountains. At the time, early 1830s, he was employed as the animal preserver at the Museum of the Zoological Society in London, which followed on from his initial London occupation as a taxidermist. He's famously on record as having preserved a thick-kneed bustard for King George IV. And he then worked on this collection of birds, which was sent back from the Himalayas to the Zoological Society in the late 1820s. And Gould decided to privately publish an imperial folio volume of hand-coloured lithographs of these birds, and his wife Elizabeth did the illustrations. It was a very successful publication. Subscribers included members of the royal family and distinguished gentlemen naturalists, and it encouraged him to continue in this vein. He moved on to his Birds of Europe next, and then in 1838 he made a famous trip to Australia, where he established himself as one of the great early naturalists of Australia. The 4 Gould slides I've got to show you. This is Muscicappa melanops, a type of flycatcher on the left, and Garrulus leucolophus on the right. These are also 2 more beautiful Gould birds. That's a hornbill, Bucerus cavatus, and the Bengal owl, looking rather cross on the right there. Right, finally, another beautiful animal and bird set of illustrations by this gentleman, John Edward Gray, FRS, and his book Illustrations of Indian Zoology. This portrait on the left is Gray, one of our actual Royal Society portraits, which hangs on the wall here at the Society. As you go around the building, you'll see lots of portraits of our distinguished past fellows and presidents. And the animal on the right is the Bengals Civet. Now, Gray was like John Gould. He didn't actually go to India. He relied on specimens sent back from the East India Company connections. At the time he wrote his book, he was assistant to the Keeper of Zoology at the British Museum. He was initially employed at the British Museum to catalogue their reptile and shell collections, but over the following 20 or 30 years he seems to have catalogued virtually all the natural history specimens in the British Museum. And he was elected to the Fellowship of the Royal Society around this time, in 1832. Now, Gray's work was supported financially by General Thomas Hardwicke, who was also a Fellow of the Royal Society. He was an English soldier and naturalist who joined the East India Company at the age of 22 and lived in India for 46 years. He travelled extensively around the subcontinent, sent a lot of letters back to Joseph Banks and other Royal Society luminaries. And Hardwicke amassed a huge collection of drawings of Indian animals done by local artists, drawn from life and drawn from stuffed specimens. 4,500 in his collection, and he bequeathed all those to the British Museum. I think they've moved on to the Natural History Museum now. I think there's still an extensive Hardwicke collection at the Natural History Museum. And this Hardwicke collection was used by John Edward Gray in assembling his book. 2 more pictures to show you from that one. That's the black-headed horned pheasant on the left and the white dotted eagle on the right. Okay, that's the end of my little section.